the efforts put in by around 300 volunteers that were trained alongside with tree professionals. They set out to measure 721 random plots scattered throughout the 157,200 hectares that make up inner, outer, and therefore greater London. And that made it the largest citizen science urban forestry survey in the world. And I think that's something to be quite proud of, really. 2/3 of those plots were fully completed by volunteers with help from the professionals as well. And the results are now back from the States, thanks to Dave and his team in this over there. And so we're beginning to get a picture of what London's urban forest actually looks like. And we're still interpreting a lot of those results, so I won't have them all here for you in this presentation. But being a random sample, these plots could land anywhere, and that's because London's urban forest is everywhere. So we're thinking landscape scale, and by the Food and Agriculture Organisation's definition of canopy cover, many of our towns and cities are forests. And if we think about that, I mean, why should nature be something we have to get into a car and drive off and see somewhere else? Why can't we just go out of our front doors and see it straight away? Anyway, this is Team 40, who were with Craig Harrison from the Forestry Commission. He was their professional, and these were the two volunteers. And this is a relatively straightforward plot, 100% grass. And we put in circular plots, 11.3 metres in radius, gives us about an acre, or a tenth of an acre, or 0.04 of a hectare. And actually, some of the volunteers got quite upset that they didn't get trees in their plots. And I think that's understandable, but it also highlights that level of commitment, really. Really encouraging. Some of the plots weren't so straightforward and not so easy. So where we had trees in plots, we took measurements on the tree height, the crown size, the height of the crown, the health of the crown. And it was an aggregation of all these sample plots that provides that overall picture of London's urban forest resource. But the great thing about working with communities is before that data came back from the States, actually even before it went out to the States, there's that whole social dimension to this project and raising awareness about the trees around us and what they're doing, and people really bought into it. And you know, it's essentially their urban forest, and it would be great to carry this forward and capitalise on that enthusiasm as well. So we carried out initial training with the volunteers, and there's Jim instructing some of the volunteers on measuring the diameter of the tree. But it was also about meeting new friends and understanding a little bit more about those essential functions that trees are performing, because a lot of these volunteers knew they liked trees, but actually by going out into the field to do the work to establish those pounds values that eco provides, what they actually gained an insight into as well was that intrinsic value, you know. And I think that deeper realisation is something really important for people to understand, that trees are doing all this work around us, filtering the air pollutants, storing the carbon, all that kind of thing, all at the same time, at very little cost, but quietly as well. So we've got the data back, and we've only just started looking at it. Literally, it was a couple of weeks ago. So what are the implications for urban forest management? And iTree, the data it provides, has been a great way to start having conversations and discussions based around everything that comes back. There are those values, of course, as well, but we're still working through those at the moment. So we're just going to concentrate on just a little bit of the structural resource. This is all quite hot off the press, as it were. So first and foremost, that's about understanding what the urban forest actually is. What do we mean by the urban forest? And That's an important thing to define. And where are the trees? Well, in London, this is where the trees are, and that's around a 40% public and 60% private split. And that's typical-ish. In Torbay, there was 30% public trees, 70% private trees. I think 70-30 was also a figure in Trees and Towns too, and it's something that they find in the States as well. So that's 60% of the urban forest in private hands, but delivering public benefit. One of the things we have had time to do, and thanks to some additional work at Forest Research, we've been able to pick out the sizes of those trees within the different land use categories. So, although those private properties hold 60% of the urban forest, of that tree resource, it's actually in cemeteries and parks, where you've got some of the biggest trees, and wetlands as well. Utility was a bit of a surprise. That land use category covers things like sewerage works and electrical substations, things like that. So what we've got is all the different land uses across the bottom, and then the lighter the colour, the smaller the tree. And the darker the colour, the larger the tree. So it's just interesting to start looking at it in that way. What species have we got? Most common species in inner London are birch, or betula, tilia, lime, and apple, malus. And I know when these results were announced the other week at the London Relief Tree and Woodlands Awards, there was a couple of eyebrows raised at, really, is apple the most commonest tree species in inner London? And it's good to inquire and question these results. And apple, yes, it is. We need to remember that 60% of the urban forest is in private hands, so that's small gardens behind walls. And, our perception normally is working with those larger trees that we see on the street every day, the ones we interact with. So the tree densities in inner London there were around 46 trees per hectare, and that compares favourably with Torbay. It was around 26 trees per hectare, and in Edinburgh it's 55. We also have to remember this is inner London as well. In outer London the picture changes a little bit, and also maybe aligns more closely with our perception of what the commonest tree species would be, with sycamore, or Acer pseudoplatanus, oak, or quercus, and hawthorn, Crataegus, are the most commonest species, with 8% for the sycamore and oak and 6% for the hawthorn, respectively. The density in outer London then goes up to around 55 trees per hectare. This other section here, we do know what all those other trees are, but if we put them all in, it would make a very messy pie chart. In total, we found 130 tree varieties and 112 tree species. We haven't got them all. Remember, this is a sample survey, but the idea with the sample survey is that it gives you a representative sample, so it's the most important, the commonest trees will be the same with regards to their dominance in the landscape and their leaf area. And diversity as well. One of the things we could look at with the iTree data, and this comes from some work I've been doing with Kevin Frediani, which we started at last year's Tree Diversity Conference in Sweden. How diverse is London's urban forest? And what this shows is the relative presence in the landscape based on that leaf area and population, and then a species rank along the bottom bar. And I'm ever so sorry because the numbers haven't appeared along there. But London's the brown long line. So far, London is the most diverse urban forest we've evaluated with iTree Eco in the UK. Just to put that into some context, we could make a comparison or just superimpose that onto some work that Hubble did in the 80s, just so we can see where other forest types are. So the long black line on the top is tropical forest, and then we've got montane forest here, where you've got few tree species and a much steeper curve. But it's early days, but this is just to show you what this type of data can be used for going forward, because it's going to become increasingly important and useful in the face of a changing climate with changing temperatures and the novel pests and diseases we're going to be seeing, and which Mike Rout may scare us with later. So I'd like to conclude with and wrap up with one of Jim's slides. This is just one of his strategic objectives. There were more, but it was just to share my thoughts about what the implications are for this iTree eco study and its implications for urban forest management. I mean, do we agree with this statement? London's urban forests should be perceived and strategically managed as a single resource covering the whole of Greater London. Incidentally, I do agree with that, but I'd like to point out that does not negate the need for more tactical and practical management at the borough, street, and individual tree level. This is important because we need to start managing our urban areas at this landscape scale. 80% of us now live in towns and cities, as we heard earlier, and we know that trees make better places to live because they improve our health and well-being. But we forget sometimes, I think, that as a race or as a species, we've been hunter-gatherers for thousands and thousands of years, and actually we've been living in cities sort of this much of the time. And perhaps that's why they're bad for our health, because we don't build them that well. So trees can only improve that situation. And using the iTree data can help us to make more informed decisions about what type of tree, so given the current species composition, what type of tree should we plant, what ultimate size of tree, given the structural composition of the resource, should we plant, and where should it be planted? Where there's lowest canopy cover, or where there's highest social deprivation, or where it will filter more pollution, or where it will increase consumer spending, or where it will improve property prices, or lower peak summer temperatures, or maybe a mix of all of those. But iTree is just the start of that, really. The iTree Eco Survey provides the data, but data doesn't make action, and that's what comes next. So by planting the right tree in the right place, just like those Victorian plantings, we can leave a legacy for our children too, and other future generations of London, to inhabit livable cities that are nice places, really, to live, work, and play. Thank you.
Many, many thanks for that, Kenton. That was excellent. I love that last slide. That's great. That mural. Where was that taken?
It's in Warsaw, Poland.
Oh, right. Very good. Excellent. We could do with a few murals like that in Belfast. Point taken. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Frederic Segur from France. Frederic has university degrees in biology and ecology and is also forest engineer. He's worked on urban forest policy in France for more than 20 years, first as private consultant, then for the Greater Lyon Authority, where he has created the Trees and Landscape Department. I've heard lots of good things about what Frederic's doing in Lyon, so I'm fascinated to hear his talk. This department is in charge of the city nature strategy, in particular with the Tree Charter that brings together more than 100 actors from the public, private and voluntary sectors. It also works on the landscape part of the urban projects and street tree management. Frederic is a member of the Scientific Council of Plantes et Cités, the French institute managing research programs on urban landscape topics, and is also vice president of Qualipaysage, the French professional organization for landscape companies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Frederic Segur.
Thank you, Mark, for this presentation. First, I would like to thank Keith and Barcham Trees for their invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today with you, and also an opportunity to present urban tree policy we developed in Lyon for 25 years. So, Lyon is the second largest metropolitan area in France after Paris. It's located in the southeast of France, in the Rhône-Alpes region. Greater Lyon includes 59 municipalities, a population of 1.3 million inhabitants, and almost 800 good restaurants. Because Lyon is most famous for its gastronomy, rather than for its urban forestry policy, until today, I hope. We were recently able to estimate from photo interpretation that the urban tree canopy cover amounts about 14,500 hectares, which represent 27% of the land area. The Greater Lyon Authority is involved in urban forestry at 3 different levels: the maintenance and planting of trees in the highway and public squares across the whole Greater Lyon area. Today, it represents 100,000 trees. Also, the development of new green space and natural areas. At this point in time, about 9,000 hectares of green space have been made accessible to the local population. And also the statutory protection of trees in urban planning documents, 6,700 hectares of trees are protected in our land use plan. Also, France have had the tradition of planting trees along roads and pathways since the 17th century. It is mostly from the 1850s that an ambitious and very deliberate tree planting policy was introduced as part of the development of modern metropolis. The model developed in Paris by Baron Haussmann was then replicated in most major French cities and also inspired the development of many other metropolis across the world. The arguments in favor of large-scale planting of trees in the city were then already highlighting the notion of service provided by trees on social aspects as recreation, health, environmental aspects, shade, air purification, water management, but also on economical aspects as image and attractiveness of the city. It is therefore interesting to note that what we have recently come to describe as the 3 pillars of sustainable development was already in the 19th century at the heart of policies for massive investment in urban tree planting. Beyond the quantitative aspects that characterize this period, it is also important to notice the great technical skills involved in these plantations. Even today, most of the trees found along avenues or in parks and squares were planted during this ambitious era that lasted until the end of the century and then faded in France from the First World War. In the 20th century, the question of the tree in the city becomes secondary and its preservation grows more and more problematic. The definition of new priorities for urban development comes along with the progressive loss of interest, but also of arboricultural knowledge. This loss of technical knowledge, coupled with the invention of the chainsaw from the 50s, has led to a real massacre suffered by a majority of urban trees in France, and that led to a significant deterioration of the sanitary health and structural condition of this natural heritage. An inventory conducted in Greater Lyon in 1994 shows that more than 60% of the trees showed mechanical defect attributable to radical pruning conducted between 1950 and 1990. The result of this loss of interest was a massive loss of trees at that time. Archival images show very well the scale of cuttings and the severity of the value crisis that affected urban trees at that time. In that era, trees also suffered a lot from urban sprawl. Natural areas were regarded as simple land reserve for development devoid of other value. Urban sprawl also broke or pushed far away the relationship between the city and the surrounding countryside, generating a growing social demand for better access and proximity to nature from city dwellers. It is precisely this criticism of the functional city and the mobilization of residents and community organizations to safeguard and improve their living environment that is at the origin of the emergence in the early 90s of a new approach to the question of the place of the nature in the city. Several policy changes and political commitments took place through the development and adoption of an urban ecology charter in 1992, which was updated in 1997, and then a first tree charter in 2000. These key documents have helped to turn these emerging issues and aspirations into a coherent strategy that can be embedded within all the Greater Lyon authorities' plans and policies. The tree charter allows significant progress from a qualitative point of view, putting trees and landscape into the heart of urban planning and design project. It embodies a real cultural change and the return to a balanced and broad vision of the development of public spaces. The tree charter has also had a significant impact on the number of trees planted in public spaces, a direct consequence of the return of satisfaction of the inhabitants which legitimized this strategy. The number of trees has more than doubled in the past 20 years. Among other significant impacts, the first tree charter can also be credited for a very strong diversification in the species used in urban plantings. The diversification strategy was particularly related to the problem of monoculture of the plane tree and the discovery of significant health problems with the canker-stain disease. Today, more than 280 species and varieties of trees are used in street plantations. Another objective of this diversification strategy is to choose the right tree for the right place, as you say. In particular, to limit recurrent need of maintenance and pruning. One of the major advances of the tree charter is to have allowed the growth of the urban tree population while controlling and even decreasing budgets spent on maintenance. In green on this graph, we see the sustained growth in the number of trees in streets and civic space. The yellow curve shows the maintenance cost evolution. In the Greater Lyon, all the work is outsourced to private companies. And finally, the red curve shows the same budgetary evolution in constant euro, that's to say, taking inflation into account. These results also owe a lot to the tree monitoring system which we were able to set up. This involved the development of a team of specialists in arboriculture for monitoring tree health